Hello everyone, my name is Ronan Daniel, and I am a second-year student studying game development at Centennial College. My specialty is narrative design, and in my two-part video series, I'll be taking a look at a couple applications of narrative design in games. In this video, I'll be taking a look at two methods of creating a game and how narrative is designed in each one, along with a few examples from existing titles. Firstly, let's look at method 1, coming up with the mechanic and wrapping a narrative around it. The most common way to approach this is designing an existing game genre, such as platformer or first-person shooter. These genres come with a preset of mechanics that are expected out of them. This is how you get your core mechanic. For example, a 2D platformer will at least have left and right movement and jumping. Now, how do we decide what narrative to wrap it in? Well, first, we need to assess what the properties and feel of the mechanic is. Let's look at some examples. Rain World has snappy, nimble movement. On top of that, you have the ability to crawl, climb, and pounce. All of these mechanics and configurations give the player the feeling that they're controlling a small creature. Hence why Rain World's narrative has the player control a small creature, Slugcat. Grease has simple, swift movement, the acceleration is fast, and the top speed is moderate. There is some weight when switching directions, but otherwise very snappy. This configuration fits the graceful humanoid character that you control. So you need to understand how the mechanics are configured and how they feel to play before you can start understanding what kinds of narratives that mechanic can be assigned. The great part of this is that one kind of mechanic can be fitted with several different narratives, depending on what you want to deliver. The configuration of the mechanic does considerably affect how that mechanic feels to play, but the narrative is also a large contributor. Inscription's card game is a great example of this. The game is built around a certain set of rules regarding card placement, combat, card stats, costs, and the damage scale. However, there are 4 characters called scribes that play the game under different narrative settings. Leshy plays under a wilderness animalistic setting, Grimora plays under a graveyard skeletal setting, PO3 plays under a sci-fi dystopian setting, and Magnificus plays under a magical fantasy setting. Despite being the same base game with the same core mechanics, each version of the game delivers on a unique feel just by changing the narrative context. When deciding the narrative for your game, ask yourself why you choose the narrative you do. What kind of feeling do you want to evoke in the player? What kind of message do you want to deliver? Ask yourself, do you want to focus on the story or the gameplay? The answers to these questions will help you home in on what narrative will best fit your game and your set of mechanics. Alright, so we've taken a look at method 1, starting with the mechanics and creating the narrative around them. Let's look at method 2, starting with a narrative and creating the mechanics around it. The way you'd approach this is by starting with a story you want to tell, typically phrased as a single sentence that describes the narrative and the player's role. Let's look at Papers, Please as an example. Papers, Please is a game where the player plays as a border crossing inspector, and they have to inspect the traveler's papers to determine who goes through and who doesn't. The crucial part to include in your story summary is the player. Think about what the player's role is in the story. Make sure their role is something interactive and fun. The way you decide to include the player is where you'll find the mechanics of your game. In my Papers, Please example, we have to ask how. How does the player determine who gets to go through? Well, they'll have to check the information printed on their documents, whether it be text or images, and stamp the passport with an accept or denied based on whether the information matches the requirements given to the player. That is the core mechanic of Papers, Please. Another example is Five Nights at Freddy's. This is a game where the player plays as a night guard in a pizzeria establishment, and they have to stay at their post while also trying to stop hostile animatronics from attacking them. How does the player stop them? Well, they have access to doors, they can close on the animatronics to stop them from getting closer. A big mistake people often make, and even I have made, is coming up with a story and not thinking about the player. You might end up creating a beautiful and emotional narrative, but the player's role is loose and their interactions are dull. As a result, the mechanics fall flat, and the experience is not as enjoyable. You end up with something that would be better suited as a novel than a game. To prevent this, always think about the player and their experience. That is the core, the foundation of any game. If you get it right, this is a great method of creating a game. Since you aren't creating off of any existing genre, it allows you to think outside the box and create something unique. Alright, so those are two methods you can use to start your game narrative. But what about when you already have your core mechanics and narrative, and you want to add more? Well, since you already have a setting, you'd likely be building off the existing narrative to avoid any clashes or creating something out of place. Let's look at Endoparasitic as an example. The game involves a player using one arm to navigate a sci-fi lab while avoiding/killing zombie-like monsters that evolved out of a parasite outbreak within the lab. During development, the creator mentioned in a devlog, link in the description, about wanting to add a weapon that did AoE damage. He based it off a grenade launcher, but unfortunately a grenade launcher full of explosives in a science lab didn't really make any sense. So, to better fit the narrative, he thought of making a flare gun, which kept the original intent, but fit the lab setting a lot better. Even other sub-mechanics of the game were designed around this setting, like the way the player opens doors. Each door is linked to a button, and with a simple click, they slide open. However, if the setting were different, like, say, a modern time period where the conflict was a zombie apocalypse, the doors might be hinged and require a manual pull to open. And maybe an actual grenade launcher would fit the setting better as well. To retain the puzzle aspects of finding the button to open the door, maybe some doors could require finding keys. That could also lead to a potential lock mechanic, similar to how you reload your weapon or unlock medpacks. So here, we can see how different narratives can lead to different iterations of sub-mechanics and slight changes in gameplay. Going back to Inscription, we can also see this happen with the cost/resource mechanic. In each version of the game, the resource the player uses to place cards is both narratively and functionally different, which leads to interesting and distinct styles of gameplay. Blood is gained through sacrificing your current cards in play, bones are gained through killing cards, energy is gained incrementally after each turn, and different gems are acquired as cards. This is an interesting thing to consider in your games. Think about how other narratives might fit your mechanics and what kinds of sub-mechanics and systems will fit those different narratives. You might get some interesting dynamics around each one that might be more appealing. Okay, to summarize, there are two methods to creating a game and its narrative. You could start with either mechanics or narrative first, and base the other off whichever you start with. When starting with mechanics, usually you'd base it off an existing game genre, and try to get the feel of the mechanics down so you can decide what narrative will fit. And when starting with a narrative, you think about a story and think about the player's role within that story, typically phrased as a single sentence. Whatever you decide their role to be, that is where you will find the mechanics of your game. Finally, while iterating and adding to your game, think about the narrative that you've chosen and potentially other kinds of narratives and how each new mechanic/system you add can be tuned to those narratives. Any of these methods can be used to create a wonderful game and engaging narrative. It's all up to you on how you design it. Thank you all for watching, and goodbye.